welcome to episode 3 of the Passionate Spirit podcast. Thanks for joining me. As I alluded to in the introductory video, each week I'm going to explore a different aspect of my own passions, and hopefully they are resonating with your own personal journeys. And this past couple of weeks, what I've been up to is remastering. What is remastering exactly? Well, remastering is taking a previously existing video or recording, or perhaps something else altogether. In my case, it's sound recordings, and bringing them perhaps up to date with our latest technology. Now, in my case, my very first album that was released commercially came out in 1994. That was my first album called Bradfield, Harmony in the Chaos. And as you can imagine, we're 30 years later. Wow. And technology has improved. But what we've got to be careful about is that when we remaster, we're not remixing. So let me explain the difference. Remixing is, let's say we have all the different tracks on a recording, the vocals, the piano, the guitars, the bass, the drums, the strings, synthesizers, and then rebalancing all of this. This is remixing. And remixing can be extremely time excruciating, and also pretty much recreate a recording. And remastering is taking the existing final recording, in this case sound again, and simply globally, tonally shaping it. So you can't actually go in and change the balance of individual instruments. What you can do is perhaps widen it slightly in terms of the left-right spectrum, change the volume. And of course, what we're trying to do is get the most relevant information in the recording maximized without distortion, without clipping. When clipping is when you go beyond, physical zero. Essentially, it's like, I guess, if we looked at an analogy in a house, for example, redecorating or renovation. The house stays the same, but we change a few things around. Whereas renovating, well, maybe the whole kitchen itself changes. The fridge and stove are revamped and updated. So you get the idea. Remastering is taking what's already there, so taking the kitchen as it is and beautifying it somewhat. Perhaps that's maybe the easiest way to explain it. So why remaster? Well, the obvious reason is that we're always seeking to have the best possible end product. And for me, as I began to go through all these recordings, because I've made almost 40 individual sound recordings through the years, to revisit them track by track, it's a rediscovery, of course, of it's like looking back at your life in a certain way. And as I mentioned at the outset, having newer technology just allows you to, just to add a little bit of sheen and overall magic to a recording that's been essentially the same, like I said, for maybe almost 30 years. And without ruining it as well, because this is always the trap. The trap is to go too far. So it's a matter of moderately beautifying, moderately updating, and preserving the the energy and the essential chemistry of the original. And this is why remixing, you can go down a rabbit hole and end up completely somewhere else. Remastering, we have essentially a nucleus that will stay the same. Same body, same sweater, but the sweater is dry cleaned. There's all the kinds of ways we could look at this. But for me as an artist, what was exciting and what continues to be exciting, because I've gone through maybe now about 10 recordings, I do maybe 1 or 2 in a day. Because as I mentioned, depending on the number of tracks on the recording, it's to look at each track, the overall balance. So the balance would be the lowest part of the song in terms of volume and the highest part, and making sure that there's a very even blend. I mentioned also widening, and this is allowing the sound to, for example, if you have a single sound that's mono, for my voice is coming to you right now straight ahead, and you have the stereo image of that. So you want, with music, for it to be as enveloping as possible, at least for stereo. And if we were talking about a surround sound, or this new type of mixing that's become available now, which is Dolby Atmos, this requires a whole new type of setup. I haven't decided if I'm going to explore that yet. Whereas the sound can come from above you, beside you, around you, behind you. And then in this way, these types of recordings require a complete remixing of each individual instrument and where it's coming from. But what we're talking about today is simply having the high frequencies, the above 8K, which is a lot of people less noticeable. And as we get older, we lose some of those higher frequencies. But it's more like air. We feel it. We feel it. Most of the activity is going in the mid frequencies, where the voice and a lot of the instruments are. And then you have the bass, which is the bass guitar or the kick drum, and the lower frequencies. And so it's shaping these with the tools that we decide to use for remastering in a very, very subtle way. What are the psychological effects of remastering? Well, it's like anything that you've become accustomed to seeing or hearing. We are very trained on what we know to be real, to be not real. We like things to be the way we've known them to be. And this, we could talk at length about why this is. But in short, it's the fact that we're creatures of habit. And me being a Taurus, I'm perhaps even a better example of a creature of habit. I like certain things to be where I left them, how I have remembered them. And when it comes to the ear, if I was to take one of these recordings I'm talking about and simply change one of the instruments, it would be completely almost disorienting for the ears. Why? Because they've been hearing it that way for so long, and they're accustomed to hearing it that way. So any type of change is noticeable. So psychologically, it's a matter of getting past that. And this is why remastering is so much easier to digest than remixing, because it's subtle tonal changes. The overall recording itself is virtually the same. We could say maybe it's like, another analogy that's coming to me is like putting icing, a different icing on the cake. It's the same cake, but just with a fresh icing. And if we were looking at it in terms of percentage, I would say maybe an improvement sonically of anywhere from 10 to 20% in terms of what I'm hearing. And that's actually quite a lot. It's 1/5 of improvement. And it's very satisfying to hear something that has been so ingrained in my own life for so long, and perhaps ingrained in yours as well. And then just to hear it with a fresh sparkle, a fresh je ne sais pas quoi. It's almost intangible, but just better and fresher, newer. And we all love what's new and fresh. And by keeping the vast majority of it intact, it's just a really pleasant experience. And so going through all these tracks, what I lived was just, it's nice. And again, it's like a little surprise, just something, wow, it's just a little bit more beautiful than it was. And that's a really great feeling as a composer. And subsequently, these recordings, all these remixes will be placed on my own website. So all the MP3s that you can download from my own site will be refreshed. And I am also updating these very soon on the streaming services. And I can mention that as well, is that when I went back, in the 90s, even the beginning of 2000s, a lot of the streaming services like iTunes at the time weren't giving you options of 24-bit files. And again, technically, we were using more 16-bit. And so the difference between 16-bit and 24-bit is just a little more clarity. Again, just a little bit better defined. And so that's something else that in terms of doing all this remastering, I'm able to finalize them and master them in 24-bit, which is wonderful as well. We went through this really crazy period for a long time of maximizing loudness, and a lot of it was to do with dance music and other types of high energy sound. And the trick with remastering is to make it subtly louder without losing the dynamic range. And that's a very, very delicate balance, because it's mainly working with transients. And what we're talking about with transients is peak spikes in the audio signal that can make the rest of the music less loud because they're taking up room in the sonic spectrum. So what we do to equalize that is we use different forms of limiters. And the great thing with the remastering that I'm doing now is I'm adding subtle saturation. And saturation diminishes these peaks. They're almost like spikes. When you look at the sound waves, say you have a wave and you see a spike, and that can be a cymbal, it can be a voice, a drum. And so we're diminishing them without making them less loud. And this is the trick of saturation. And we're not going to go all into the mechanics of that, but suffice to say that saturation makes things a little rounder and a little bit more analog. And this is another thing. When you're working in the digital domain, it's almost recreating analog saturation. This was achieved in the old days, like for my first recordings with reel-to-reel tapes, either 8-track or 16-track, or even 4-track going back previous to that. And you would get a natural type of compression through the saturation when it was being recorded onto the physical tape medium. So that's another thing that I've been doing with this saturation. And in terms of the actual plugins that I'm using this time, for anyone who is at all interested, I started running it through a plugin called BB Tubes, which is made by Waves. This is a relatively new plugin that adds really nice warm saturation. And you can work on the either beauty side or Beast side, and that's what the BB stands for, Beauty and the Beast. And me being a big fan of Beauty and the Beast, the TV series back in the 90s, with Vincent and Catherine in the tunnels underneath New York, I was immediately drawn to that just by the name itself. After I come out of BB Tubes, I'm going into another plugin that's relatively new called the God Particle. And this is, it's almost like magic. It's a combination of different mastering plugins all combined into one unit where you can adjust, again, high, mids, and lows going into a limiter. And this is made by a man who's a renowned engineer himself, Jaden Joshua, and released to a company called Cradle. Coming out of that, I'm going into a final limiter made by UA, Universal Audio, and then mastering. And I'm doing all this in my own studio, mastering into 24-bit, and then that's pretty much it. I want to mention as well, as an artist, a composer, a songwriter, my goal is always to capture the fleeting glimpse. And so sonically, and there's always the limitations of technology or our instruments or situational restrictions. So when you have the chance to revisit something you've created previously, just this week noticing that people are still enjoying music that I wrote 25 years ago, it's a great feeling. So now with these freshly remastered tracks, it gives you as well a little, it's just a little upgrade. And so I find that really important. So the experience for me, again, has been one of, it's like rediscovering an old friend. And they ultimately are like, you're even better than I remember you, or even more beautiful than I remember you, or even smarter or wiser than how I remember you. Hello, baby. And this has really been a wonderful experience. And ultimately, we could say, what a majestic experience. As I have my beautiful cat come to see me. So I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of the Passionate Spirit podcast. Hasn't been too technical for you. And understand a little bit of taking something old and making it new again while honoring its heritage. That's what remastering has been for me. Have a beautiful day.